So let's look at how membership occurs in committees. There are basically three types of members to a committee. There are the national standards bodies that have decided that the topic of that committee is of interest to them and they wish to engage in that discussion actively, and we call these the participating members. Then we have a group of national standards bodies who will think that topic is of interest, but we don't have the resources, or for other reasons we're not able to participate, but we want to receive the information from that committee. So they're called observing members. Now, there are also a lot of very well-respected international organizations. The International Institute of Physics, the International Institute of Chemistry, that need to engage with ISO to help in the standards development process. And there is a way for them to become recognized as what we refer to as a liaison organization within a committee. Of these three categories, only the participating members get to vote on documents. Whilst the main development process is by consensus, and I'll come to that in a minute, at the end of certain stages, there is a voting process. So if you want to actually determine the outcome of a standard, you really have to be a participating member. One of the problems we're facing in ISO at this time is that lots of participating members vote on one or two of the documents in a committee, but not all of them. And ISO has introduced rules that if you miss more than 2 or 3 votes, then your status will be downgraded from participating member to observing member. That rule has been around for a long time, but what is happening now is that ISO is being much more proactive in monitoring the voting and downgrading members. At this time, the information I have is DGN is a member of 152 technical committees and subcommittees. I think that's correct, but we will discuss that more tomorrow, I think. Okay. Liaisons are an interesting challenge because there are some very big organizations in this world. Let's take the car manufacturer General Motors. At one time, General Motors had the 7th biggest GDP in the world, ahead of many countries. And General Motors felt, well, why shouldn't we be allowed to influence these standards? I mean, after all, they do a lot of the research that leads to them being created. So ISO from time to time reviews how liaisons could become a member or how voting should be conducted within its processes. So should it have a subscription model, a bit like the International Telecommunications Union, so that you pay a certain amount of money and you become a member, irrespective of your organization? Or should your authority and voting rights be determined by your gross domestic product? In which case, USA, China, the G7 countries would dominate everything. Or should it be done by population size? In which case, China, India, Mexico, you're quite a large country, but Indonesia, Pakistan, Brazil, they would be the most influential bodies. But at the moment, we have the one country, one vote system. Why is ISO called ISO? Okay, it's the International Organization for Standardization, IOS, not ISO. But the Greek word isos means equal. So they have shortened ISOS to ISO to say that every country is equal and has one vote in the proceedings. Obviously, that upsets the Americans greatly. They have a population of 350 or 70 million. That is about the equivalent of the total population of Europe, yet Europe gets 25 votes compared to the US getting 1. So that, whatever system you would choose will cause an imbalance at the end of the day. But at the moment, we're still staying with the one country, one vote system. Okay. Remuneration. Yes, lovely. When you become a member of ISO, and if you remember, I said there's these different categories of full members, correspondent, subscriber members. The ISO Council says you have so many units of subscription to pay. And a unit can be based on your country's GDP, your population, a number of factors are taken into consideration. And depending on the number of units you're required to have, will depend on your subscription. I believe Mexico, because you're number 11 in the world economy for GDP, something like that, you have a very high subscription rate. UK has a very high subscription rate because of our GDP. So all the national standards bodies have to pay an annual subscription to ISO. ISO Central Secretariat staff are obviously paid from that received subscription. Most of the people who sit on things like the ISO General Assembly, the ISO Council, or the ISO Technical Management Board are usually staff members from national standards bodies. Not always, but generally they are the staff members. So they are paid by their national standards body. But as you can see, the bottom bit, committee chairman, working group conveners, the experts receive no funding from ISO. And when we were saying a moment ago, we have 255 technical committees, 530 subcommittees, nearly 3,000 working groups. It's estimated we have a population in this group of about 100,000 people working for ISO without any funding from ISO whatsoever. Now, that is a big issue, and it's something that may have to change in the future. Revenue models for standardization are under threat, but that's another discussion. But it's just people keep saying, well, you're paid by ISO. No, I'm not. I'm a staff member from British Standards Institution, and they have made a commitment to support certain activities, so they pay for my time. People say standards should be free. I'm not cheap. I want to be paid. I see everyone driving shiny cars and living in big houses. I want the same. Again, this is a political issue. The European Committee for Standards was seriously thinking of passing regulations to say all standards should be free. How would we generate revenue in order to survive and to operate the system? It's a very, very interesting discussion, because when you look at a standard, most of them are, 20, 30 pages long. They're not particularly big. And you compare the cost of that standard to, for example, a university textbook, which would be like this thick, 400 pages. You pay how much for the textbook? $100. And yet for the 20-page standard, you pay $200? Wow. Yes. Revenue models. Okay. So the formal standard development process, it aims to be transparent, timely, and market relevant. We live in the world. We employ formal rules of procedure and formal rules for the presentation of standards, which are normally referred to as the ISO and IEC directives. And similarly, the European standards bodies, and I'm sure COPAN has rules about how it operates, and as does the Pacific area rules. Who gets involved? Well, when I was discussing about the benefits of standards and saying that, you know, we try and prevent manufacturers from creating monopolies. So these are typical sorts of backgrounds to the experts who will participate in drafting standards: industry, government, consumers, labor, trades union representatives, academic organizations. There's a group we call standards application organizations, which is obviously the standards bodies, the certification bodies, the testing laboratories. And increasingly, we're seeing non-governmental organizations also getting involved. You remember I said we're moving in standardization from products to processes to good practices. And a lot of those NGOs are involved in that good practice area, particularly. A very quick overview of what the standards development process has to involve. Well, there's an initiation process. Someone has to propose a project. Then someone has to do a bit of drafting. Public comment. The World Trade Organization requires that any document that can establish regulations shall be offered for public review for a minimum period of 8 weeks. So within the ISO process and within the national standards body processes, most of them require a public consultation of at least one stage of the development documents to be subject to public review. Okay? And because of that public review, you will receive a lot of comments on the document. Those comments have to be processed, the draft amended. Then there is some sort of approval mechanism, a publication process, and finally, after it's been published, after a certain amount of time, we have to review the standards to make sure they're still adequate. I talked a little bit about full international standards are reviewed after 5 years, but technical specifications or publicly available specifications after 3 years. Okay? So putting this a little bit more into ISO language, we talk about an NP, or some people still refer to them as new work item proposal, or NWIP. That's the initiation stage. Then there is an optional stage. Perhaps a group will do a very quick rough working draft, and maybe that goes through several iterations. Then you can get a committee draft, which is a document that is circulated only within the committee and balloted by the members of the committee for approval. Except that ISO's just changed that rule. You no longer ballot it. The chair has to decide if it's acceptable. After the committee draft stage, the draft is created at what we call the Draft International Standards stage, the DIS stage. Now, the difference between a committee draft and the DIS is that the DIS is circulated to all 165 members of ISO for a ballot. And we have interesting balloting response ratings. So in order for a draft to be approved, 66% of the members of the committee have to approve it, and not more than 25% of all the ISO members who voted on it have to reject it. This is why we come to the strange conclusion of saying that an international standard is approved at the 75% level, because it's not more than the 25% of all ISO members rejecting it. If at the DIS stage, we get 100% approval from all the national standards bodies that voted on it, then we can go to publication. However, again, with the DIS votes, the national standards bodies have the right to submit comments. So there can be a comments review and changing the text, amending it to what is called the draft or final draft international standard. And that then gets balloted again, but this time there should be no comments. The final draft international standard is supposed to be the final text of the standard that will be published if it is approved. The reason this step was introduced in about 1995 was that some countries noticed that after the DIS stage, committees were changing about 20% of their standards. And they said, but that's not what we voted on at the DIS stage. So we want to see absolutely what is the final draft before publication. So this is why I would say in the majority of cases, you will have an FDIS stage. It's rare that you get 100% approval at DIS. Okay? Why is the initiation stage so important? ISO 9001, which I think some of you are familiar with, is about 25 pages. How much did it cost to develop? Can you guess? $1 million a page. Think about it. It took about 4 or 5 years, 6 meetings, 150 people per meeting. They each spend $2,000 on airplanes or travel costs. They each spend $2,000 on hotel costs. They spend another $1,000 on food. They have to have their salaries paid whilst they're attending the meeting. When you take all of these costs in, $1 million a page. So standards are not cheap. So we have to have an initiation process, which is why when I talked about this new work item proposal, there is a balloting process to ensure that a certain number of standard bodies will support the project and will send experts to work on it. And if those criteria are not met, the project is not initiated. But yes, when you see one of those big standards, start thinking about how much it costs to produce it. ISO, in theory, prefers to work by consensus wherever possible. So within working groups, before a rough working draft is moved to being the committee draft, and before the committee draft is moved to the draft international standard stage, we are meant to achieve consensus. Consensus does not mean unanimity. It is possible to proceed with the project while noting that certain countries do not agree with the document. Okay? We are obliged to try and resolve all the disagreements, but you know that sometimes in a committee you're dealing with a topic where one country has a big manufacturer with a very specific commercial viewpoint, so wants to block the standard. And they will consistently say, we object, we object, we object. But if the rest of the world wants to go on, should we stop that activity just because one country has a commercial interest? So no. So consensus is not unanimity, but we do try and achieve that. And the reason we have voting at the draft international standard stage is to demonstrate the level of consensus we've achieved and also to decide if we have sufficient consensus to move forward, okay? But within working group activities, you're not meant to be voting. I know many working groups do resort to voting just to indicate how happy the members are with a piece of text. Okay, they're not meant to do it, but we allow it. So one of the key challenges coming forward for the future is how do we give confidence in products at the nanometer scale? Traditionally and historically, what has quality been about? Even back to the Middle Ages or beyond, the Roman times, it's, someone is trying to sell you something. How do you ensure you have confidence in that thing? You weigh it. Oh, but has someone cheated with the weighing system? Oh, so let's make sure the weighing system is calibrated. That's great. You have a physical product, you have a physical method of conformity assessment that gives the customer confidence. But with nanoscale issues, when you try and measure something, you affect what you are measuring. So how does that help us in the traditional model of product conformity assessment confidence? Is it that at the nanoscale we can get repeatable distortion of what we are measuring to ensure we have confidence? I don't have the answer to that. I'm sure it's one of the problems that various metrology laboratories, I know the UK's National Physical Laboratory, doing a lot of work on nano measurements. The Chinese are actually the leaders in nano measurements at this time. But that is one of the big problems for us in the future. And just a small note about the kilogram. Do you remember Napoleon's lovely platinum bull? Well, it started deteriorating. So for 20 years, people were trying to find a different way of expressing the kilogram. And finally, in 2019, they came up with the fact that it can be derived from Planck's constant. Just as the meter, which was the rod of platinum, is now determined by a certain number of wavelengths of light. So it's independent of a physical item. So we can get consistency. So some of the issues for future standardization. How can we get more inclusive participation? One of the things I haven't told you is that for these 255 technical committees and 530 subcommittees, only 36 of ISO's countries provide staff members like myself to run those committees. So it's only 36 out of the 165 actually provide resource to ISO. And of those, the leading 4 or 5, the Americans, the French, the Germans, the British, the Japanese, we control about 400 out of that total population of 750. I shouldn't use the word control. We manage, but why do you think we provide the resource? Management leads to control. So if you want to start playing the international game and influencing the international situation, you have to provide resource. Standardization is not free. One of the issues that's coming up, obviously the world is having a lot of conversation about diversity at the moment, but a lot of the standards, particularly when ergonomics issues are detailed, were based around the average measurements for men. So we have to start rethinking that. Interestingly, the chairman of the quality committee, a former chairman, once got very upset with one of the jeans manufacturing companies. He said, I go in the supermarket, I attempt to buy a pair of jeans. None of them ever fit me. I know when I take a tape measure and I measure my waist, what it says. Then I look, your jeans say the same measurement, but they are too tight or they're too big. There's no consistency. In fact, if we could crack the measurement of clothing, the fashion industry is one of the big areas we really need to deal with. Interestingly, one of the problems with the fashion industry or clothing industry is they based their measurements taken at the end of the Second World War when most people were very fit because they'd been practicing army exercise or whatever. They were thin, they were, athletic, not like us today, we just sit and watch TV all the time. So the fashion industry has a problem. They seem reluctant to deal with it. I've seen companies like Alibaba, who I visited in China, where in their development rooms, they've got all these sort of boxes. You walk in, you're scanned, then you have precise measurements and you can fit it to any of their clothing because they know how the system works. But how could we expand that to all clothing so that we know that when we order something on the internet, it will actually fit? Because think of the amount of wasted time and effort right now. I know when my son buys a new pair of shoes, he orders 3 different sizes and he sends 2 back. What a waste. In terms of sustainability, that's crazy. Okay, the next issue is revenue models. I mentioned the arguments about standards being free. Well, again, if you take someone of my son's generation, he doesn't pay for anything. He goes on the internet, all information is free. Why should he pay for standards? And this is affecting us. I can remember having a conversation with the Argentinian standards body, Iran. I said, what's your main competitor? And they said, the photocopier. They said, how is it that in the UK you can charge $150 for ISO 9001? We can only charge 3 because that's what it costs to photocopy it. Okay. I've talked a little bit about these non-national standards bodies, the ASTM, the IEEE. They're at the point where they're saying, actually, you're taking our standard, you're passing it through ANSI, and then you're presenting it to ISO, and ISO is adopting it without any change, yet we get no recognition for doing that. So now what we are beginning to see, particularly for electronic or electrical standards, is IEC, IEEE, and then the number of the standard. So that actually within the headline, you can recognize that it's an IEEE standard. Many of the other standards development organizations like ASTM or SAE, they also want that same recognition of where the document originated from. But not all of them have yet got agreements with ISO or the IEC to do that. This causes national standards bodies like BSI a problem because we've sent most of our national standards catalogue forward to ISO. So are we going to start demanding that they be labelled ISO, BSI, and then the number? Or you from DGN, are you going to demand ISO, DGN? That's part of the politics. The next issue I've highlighted is global organizations' rights. As I said, General Motors, 7th largest GDP in the world. Shouldn't it be allowed to influence what's produced? I don't have the answer to that. Pressures on costs and timescales. When I started working in ISO, I know it was in the age of dinosaurs, but you were allowed 7 years to develop a standard. ISO did a survey. It found that about 20% of its standards were taking 10 years or more to develop. In fact, it found one project that had been on its books for 35 years and had not been completed. That was the point at which they said, no, that's too long. Let's be more realistic. At that point, they introduced a 4-year limit. So, in fact, that's just been reduced down to a 3-year limit, maximum for producing a standard. And in fact, they would now prefer we produce documents in 12 months. That's difficult. That's really difficult. We get complaints from industry that say, look, we're a global corporation, we produced an internal standard, we circulated it to all our divisions around the world, we got agreement over the weekend, and it was published by Monday. So we take 4 days, why do you take 4 years? So there's immense pressure from industry on timescale, and ISO has to be mindful. I personally developed a document, an international document outside of ISO. I had to do it for political reasons. But there are other organizations that have developed standards outside of ISO because it's more efficient for them to do so. So ISO has to keep watching its efficiency and trying to improve it. So this is where the pressure on costs and timescales keeps coming in all the time. We're looking at new ways of working. 4 or 5 years ago, no one had ever conducted a webinar. Then GoToMeeting, WebEx, Zoom, Disco, many different systems have come along. Now, I'm doing 3 or 4 webinars a day. It's getting crazy because ISO has this rule that for a committee, for successive meetings, you should change the time of day at which the meeting is held so that no one time zone is disadvantaged. That's great if you're running one committee. I run about 4 or 5. I have to be awake at 2 o'clock in the morning for one webinar, and then the next one is 6 o'clock, the next one is 12 o'clock, until 8 o'clock at night. I hate webinars. I'm sorry. Take this away. Give me my life back. But, we are looking at new ways of working. Maybe they improve efficiency. I don't know. Webinars and comments processing, I would still prefer to have a face-to-face meeting for that. But the reality is we're getting far better engagement, far better diversity from all the different national standards bodies by working virtually. Online authoring. Online authoring has been around for a long time. Google Docs, for example, has had that for 10 years or more. ISO has been quite slow in adopting it. It has an online authoring process in pilot stage at the moment. But that should probably by next year become available. And this will enable, you'll have a text of a draft on the web, and you will add your comments within that text, and you will be able to see everyone else's comments in the draft at the same time. I've not used it. I don't know how effective it will be, but people who use Google Docs seem to love it. So maybe. There is one problem with all of these webinars and online authoring system. Countries like Iran and China ban those systems because most of them originate out of the USA. So I know with colleagues in Iran, they have workarounds, they use VPNs and other things to access them. So it's not quite perfect, but we'll see. What about new products, digital products? One type of standard we mentioned was vocabulary. Well, within the Committee for Quality, they publish ISO 9000, which is the vocabulary for all the quality standards. But not all those standards are updated at the same time. So new terms are being developed on a constant basis. Should the vocabulary standard actually just be a database? That's the best way of keeping it up to date all the time. But then how does a user who needs those terms and definitions access the database when they have, a PDF copy of the standard? We need to think about new models for working. But also we're looking at, digital twins more and more with physical architecture or engineering projects. Someone wants a system or whatever. Do we need to standardize those types of products? In fact, we are. What's driving standardization in some areas? Well, consumers. Consumers are getting a lot more noisy and vociferous. Your mobile phones. We saw the Arab Spring revolution a few years ago with all the overthrow of Arabic country governments. That was because people now have much greater access to communications processes. And that, if someone produces a car which is dangerous now, you'll get a lot of complaints very quickly, and the regulators will be looking at this. And any mistakes in the regulation about, well, actually the car complied with all the rules. Yes, but we know it's unsafe because of this. You will see the regulators being forced to act. And one way they can act is through asking ISO or the national standards bodies to produce new standards. The other issue is something called global relevance. Why would you, in this day and age, create a national standard rather than an international standard? There are some reasons. For example, in the construction industry, if you have a building, the roof has to be tied to the building. What determines the size of the bolts that you have to use? It's the local variation in wind speed. So there are good reasons why you have national documents rather than purely international. But I gave you the benefits of standardization. Most of those were focused on the international benefits of global supply chains, etc. So what we've seen in ISO is they have allowed standards to be published, but with national variations as annexes to the standard. We don't like it, but sometimes we just have to accept that that is necessary. So will we see more of those types of standards? I don't know. So I think that's just about the end of the conversation. You raised a very interesting discussion point with me about shipping containers and how the cost of standardizing the containers, I think it was in the 1970s, roughly, when that happened. Yeah. So the cost of logistics decreased by almost 50–60% via the standardization of shipping containers. Because suddenly all the port handling equipment was standardized. All the ships, the sizes of the ships in the bays were standardized to handle the common container. And you think about the cost of logistics and moving things around the world, significantly reduced by standardizing containers. But that conversation led me to think about airplanes. Why can't the airplane companies standardize the size of hand luggage to go on board? We all are affected by this. But think about it. If they standardize the size of hand luggage, then the suitcase manufacturers could standardize the size of the suitcases they make. That brings the cost down for us, the consumers. So there are still items where standardization needs to happen. We mentioned clothing before. When I can compare two pairs of jeans and get the right size, that would be wonderful. So that really is the end of my presentation. I hope it's been interesting for you. I hope it's stimulated some thoughts for you. We will now start turning to the more procedural aspects and looking at the directives. Yes, someone is nodding. He knows what the directives are. Okay. So any questions about standardization in general?
¿Hay alguna pregunta sobre toda esta parte que hemos revisado de estandarización en general? ¿No? Así hay una de Cristo.
Muchas gracias. Te voy a agradecer, Mónica, que me ayudes a traducir. Muchas gracias. Thank you very much. Conversation. Y me gustaría comentar, creo que apenas el año pasado se firmó un acuerdo para que las normas tengan, bueno, no sé si es así, los estándares tengan una visión hacia la sustentabilidad. Que los nuevos estándares se hagan considerando esto y que las revisiones de los nuevos estándares incluyan también. Es así que se firmó, creo, en Comité.
Okay.
She is asking if there is an agreement with BSI, and I think you refer to the ISO with BSI about the standard has a vision on sustainability. And here I will refer also, or I will say that Doctora Elba Escobar, she was recently appointed by ISO to be I forgot the word, to help them in the group of experts that are actually seeing this issue in the DMV. So she was recently appointed as one of the experts in that DMV. But I will refer the question, and probably Elba can explain a little bit more about that.
Okay, ISO has had two initiatives. It set up a panel on climate change. And it also had a recent strategic advisory group on ESG, environmental social governance. The ESG committee, strategic advisory group reported, the TMB accepted the report. And one of the proposals is for setting up a standing policy committee on climate change. Now, this follows through from the adoption of the London Declaration on Climate Change from the General Assembly a year ago. More recently, from that, the TMB adopted a climate change action plan. So you need to look at the action plan, and currently the standing committee that's been created on climate change is starting to recruit the members. They haven't had the first meeting, I don't think, just yet. It could be next few days, actually, I'm not sure.
We are planning next year.
Next year, okay. Yeah. Yeah.
For example.
Okay, so that, yeah. Okay. So the answer is yes, ISO is doing things, but we're still in the early stages. I'm sure it will have greater impact in a year or so. One of the issues that's come up in my area is when you look at the ESG report, it says, why don't all of the management system standards have requirements about climate change? By which they mean, why doesn't ISO 9001 have requirements on climate change? Because it's the most widely used management standard. The committee in ISO 9001, you have some people who go, but what's climate change got to do with products and services? It doesn't have any, but you have other people who are going, well, what happens if there's a climate disaster in Australia, like all the fires? Suddenly I'm not getting my supplies from Australia anymore. So climate change can affect my components, my subparts to marine products and services. So yes, maybe 9001 should include requirements about climate change. I also run a committee on asset management, and they think that just imposing requirements on climate change is too limiting. They're going, but you should be looking at health and safety, you should be looking at social issues, you should be looking at governance issues, not just climate change. But we know that right now the world is talking about climate change, so ISO has moved on climate change. Will it move on to these other issues in the future? I don't know yet. But ISO does respond. I mean, it may be slow, but it does respond. Well, one thing I didn't tell you about, let me try and find the slide. Yeah, there. So I put TMB above the technical committees. Within the directives, TMB has ultimate authority. And I can remember in 1986, when the Montreal Protocol was signed about the use of CFCs, is that the correct term? Carbofluoro something or others. The TMB acted very quickly and instructed all ISO committees to remove reference to CFCs in their standards. So the TMB has the ultimate authority. It can override ballots. It determines what can go in standardization. Another example of the TMB taking such action, by the way, was they were talking about the digitalization of characters for different languages for using in digital information. And the standard was approved, except for one negative vote, which was from Japan, and it was voting about the Japanese language being digitalized or the alphabet being. So TMB said, we don't care that the US is approving the digitalization of the Japanese language. If Japan doesn't approve it, we're not accepting it. So TMB has the authority to override committee decisions. But yes, in terms of environmental or ESG, other issues, things are beginning to happen. Okay. Any other questions? Yes.
Thank you much. This is a very interesting presentation. You said that time ago it takes up to 10 years to make a new standard, and now it takes from 3 to 4 years.
Yeah.
Can you explain more how many times it takes to change this process, and how do you make this to reduce the time?
Okay. So ISO offers a committee at the new work item proposal stage 3 different timelines that a project can follow currently. One is 18 months, which is the accelerated timeline. Another is 2 years, which is supposed to be the medium timeline. And 3 years is the extended timeline. Okay, 3 years normally slips to about 3.5. So ISO at the Council or Technical Management Board level constantly review, are those timelines too long or too short? There have been some instances where in software development, JTC1, which is the Joint Technical Committee #1 between ISO and the IEC, said, we want a 12-month development track. And ISO agreed with it. Now, the problem with shortening development tracks is that in order to do that public consultation on documents, did I lose it? So in order to do that public comment stage, national standards bodies have to receive the text from ISO, usually in English. They have to translate it, which takes time. They have to verify the translation. Then when they circulate it for their public comment, which, as we said, the WTO insists on 8 weeks. Then they have to receive the comments from their national reviewers. They have to review those comments to decide which should go forward to represent the national position, because you will get conflicting comments from your national reviewers. Some will say this is good, some will say that's bad. The National Mirror Committee usually has to make a decision on what comments to select to send to ISO. Then those comments have to be translated into English before they're sent to ISO. Now, if you're trying to tell me that you're going to develop a document in 12 months and have more than one stage where you can do that, no. It compresses us too much. But there are projects that have been done in that time frame. And usually it's when there is a cooperation agreement between ISO and SEN and between the IEC and the European standards body CENELEC. And sometimes a project will have been approved as a European standard, but has not been used as an ISO standard. But because it's a European standard, it's already been through balloting and approval at the European level and has already been translated into 29 different languages. So in that instance, you can put forward the document on a very accelerated adoption process. And basically, you're just saying to the rest of the world, you know, do you have any real problems with this? Or can you just change the title and put ISO on it? So there are instances where an established standard is very quickly adopted. And some people say, actually, for most of ISO's work, that's how ISO should operate. Because if you're taking an established standard, that means it's been tested in the marketplace. It's being used. You've had feedback on it. It's been through improvement iterations. And really only that sort of quality of document should be being put forward at the international level. The difficulty comes when you have a lot of people saying, well, let's design the G6 mobile phone network. I think the waveform should be this. Let's go ahead and standardize that. So you're going from a one-sentence idea and you have to generate the standard. You have to go through these translation and consultation processes. And that's where it takes much longer. So when a new work item is proposed, the proposer has to indicate what they think is the preferred timeline. Now, the committee that is appointed to manage that project may decide that it wants to extend it. It may decide that instead of 18 months, it would prefer the 2-year or the 3-year timeline, because they have probably wider knowledge than the proposer about what different countries' views are on that topic. But once a committee has agreed what the timeline should be, ISO is now becoming very rigid about monitoring how committees are performing against that timeline. In fact, ISO has put in place some project management software where I, as a committee secretary, have to go and fill in the dates on different items to show the progress with the standard through working draft, committee draft, DIS, FDIS stages. But all of this is wonderful if you assume that the people in the working group are going to be nice and cooperate with each other and it's a wonderful writing system. What happens when you get severe disagreement? And this happens. As I mentioned earlier, with these more management standards where we're dealing with individuals' concepts rather than physical product standards, you get much more disagreement between people on these conceptual matters. So the timeline frequently slips is the problem. A project that was originally proposed for an 18-month timeline the committee can ask for it to be slipped to the 2-year timeline. And if it's on the 2-year timeline, ask for it to be slipped to the 3-year timeline. And in the past, you used to be able to slip to 4 years. ISO doesn't like you slipping. It's my job as a committee manager to try and whip people into performing at certain rates. Yeah, it's tough, but that's how the timeline can change in case there are difficulties within the development process. Does that answer your question? So from the initiation, the proposer gives what they think is a reasonable timeline. The committee can review it and reset it, and the development work can slip it. But overall, the timelines are set by policies from the TMB and the council. Okay. Do we have any other questions?
Thank you. Now, we have a couple of questions actually in the chat of YouTube. One is actually a request if you can comment something about how the translations are conducted for international standards, and if you can comment also about what you think are they going to be the future developments in the standard and in future technical committees.
Okay, I can answer the first question. So on this chart, at the DIS stage, at the top it says 2-month translation period followed by a 3-month ballot. And at the FDIS stage, it says 2-month translation followed by a 2-month ballot. Now, the official languages in ISO are English, French, and Russian. This causes the European body some problems because the official languages in Europe are English, French, and German. And if a standard is being developed cooperatively between ISO and SEN, we actually have to have German. Also, there are something like 23 countries that have Spanish as the first language, I believe. And ISO is coming increasingly under pressure to adopt Spanish as an official language. But then what about Chinese? You know, Chinese is the most widely spoken language in the world. So shouldn't Chinese be an official? We can argue this till it comes home. But traditionally, what used to happen was that there was no official translation period for these ballots. Instead, the committee manager, such as myself, would have to work with the French national standards body, AFNOR, to ensure that a French translation was produced before the ballot was conducted, so that each national standards body, when it received the documents for ballot, would receive the French and the English version. Okay? And that's sometimes useful because, for example, I think for chief manager in Spanish, you use the word chef, or am I getting that confused with French?
It's actually gerente.
Okay.
But share is a very similar one, and also convino. So we have this kind of people from different languages,
Right.
Spanish, as you mentioned, so they are very similar.
Okay, so there may be issues with how an English word is translated, and maybe you have a problem in Spanish, but by having the French translation available, you can see how they might have tried to resolve that same problem. Okay, it does lead to some very interesting discussions. I mean, within the management standards, we tend to use the expression interested party. Why? Because 30 years ago, the French said, we can't have stakeholder. Stakeholder means Joan of Arc, the lady who is getting burnt holding the stake. So now the French are saying, why are you not using stakeholder? Because you bloody well told us you couldn't use it. I mean, there was again a big debate with the management standards about can we use results or outcomes or outputs.
The third terms.
Yeah.
Means exactly the same in Spanish as before.
They mean exactly the same in English. We just prefer confusing everyone. Okay. So, you know, this language feedback is part of the improvement of the standards and improving clarity. But then you hit certain terms like, why do the management standards use the word documented information? Why? Because during the development process of this common structure for management standards, the Committee for Information said, you can't just use information because that's the whole purpose of our world. Everything to do with information. So you have to come up with a different word. We were trying to move away from forcing people to have documents because in this day and age, no one has paper. I don't, you know, where's my paper? We will have electronic things. So we had to come up with a phrase which in English is very strange, documented information. But it seems to have been accepted. So that's how you sometimes end up creating new terms. But you also get interesting dialogue. I mean, 23 countries use Spanish. You all have different words for different things. I can remember a conversation between a man from Argentina and a lady from Costa Rica. And he was saying, do you want, she was saying, can I have a lift to the airport with you? And his response was, yes, I'd love to have sex with you tonight. You know the joke, I don't, because it's the two versions of Spanish. Sorry, I'm not naming the individual. No. But, you know, again, with the official French translation, the Canadians don't like some of the French, and the French hate the Canadian French. Because Canadian French is basically a literal translation of English using French words. Whereas French, oh, come on, it's not a cheese, it's a brie. You know, they use a different word. So, but standardization at that level is interesting. But the translation process, as I say, used to be that the committee manager would organize for the French and very occasionally Russian. So some of the vocabularies you can see are printed in 3 columns, English, French, and Russian. But we tend to ignore Russia, sadly. Once the 2 language versions were available, we sent them to ISO to process, to circulate the DIS. Because of complaints, for example, from the Spanish-speaking countries saying, well, why can't we also have time to prepare our translations? That's why these formal translation periods have been introduced into the process. Okay? All right. Any other questions? Oh, sorry, you asked about the future. I think I covered that quite a lot on the last slide when I was discussing those issues. Or do they mean, do I have ideas of explicit future ideas for standardization? In which case, no, I don't. That's up to you. Well, except airline hand luggage. Yeah.
Was about exactly the second one.
Yeah.
But yes, it is difficult to know that.
Yeah. Okay.
¿Alguien tiene alguna pregunta adicional, algún comentario? ¿No? Yes.
Yeah, I would ask something about the BSI work.
Yes.
I want to know how the BSI identify the topics that require a national standard and how this is proposed and is developed.
Okay, in BSI, we don't have a definitive system of how we receive ideas for standards. What we do have is we have a series of criteria which our government department, our Department for Industry, has given us where it wants to see us prefer developing standards. So, where was the ISO Policy Committee? Sorry. Excuse me 1 second. So here's the ISO policy statement, and the criteria our industry department has given us is very similar to those sorts of items. You know, they say standards should improve quality, improve manufacturing efficiency, things like that. So first of all, if someone proposes an idea and we look at it and we examine it against these criteria and does it fit those criteria? And then we have a business approval process internally to say, well, has the proposer given us the equivalent of a draft standard as an input text? Or how much effort are we going to have to spend in developing that standard? Is there an existing committee for that work? Or do we need to create a new committee? Because that's additional effort. If you're creating a new committee, do we need to employ extra people in order to run that committee? Or can we subcontract that committee to a professional association or some sort of academic? So it's not, we're not allowed to prevent ideas on a strictly commercial basis, like they are not willing to pay for us, but we do have, we are permitted to think about, have we got sufficient resources, or what are the resources that the proposer is willing to provide? I mean, this is something I didn't cover with the national standards bodies when I was saying what different types there are. There are lots of different revenue models that the standards bodies use. So, BSI, any person who can demonstrate that they are knowledgeable and expert in a particular field has the right to propose standards and to participate in standards development activity. And there is no charge for them doing so. In the US, ANSI has a model where each technical committee is a profit and loss center. They set their own charges for people to participate. And if they're doing a lot of international work, they set quite high charges because they then want to sponsor the experts that they nominate to participate in ISO. That's how they ensure that they maintain their participation. AFNOR in France used to be like BSI, but it was free to participate. But it decided it needed to generate extra revenue. So now there is a fixed participation fee across all of its committees. So ANSI, the fees vary depending on the committee. AFNOR, the fees are fixed. The Dutch standards body, NEN, operates on the basis of it will only open a new committee if there is a sponsor who will fund the time of the committee manager, such as myself, to manage that committee. So there are very different models around the world. But BSI, we accept ideas from anywhere, from anyone. We do examine if we have the resources in which to start developing it now, or we may even say maybe in 1 year we will have some resources. It depends also on what they provide us with to start with. Okay, does that answer your question?
Thank you.
Okay, no problem. Any other questions?
Yeah, just a quick comment regarding what you just said.
Yeah,
I was talking with a colleague in the innovation committee, and regarding ANSI, at least, he told me that in they request ANSI to be the Mtro committee. No, or
Yeah.
they were interested in setting
Yeah.
the Mtro committee of the innovation, and ANSI has a kind of a policy that says that, well, you need to help us, paying ISO fees, which are very expensive.
Yeah.
So actually the quote for the Mtro committees, this organization who wants to run Mtro committees, is $20,000 per year.
okay,
That's what they have to pay to ANSI, to help ANSI to pay ISO fees. So, well, I just want to mention that because it was related.
and the ANSI model is slightly different. The standards body does not consist of people who manage standards committees. The standards body consists of people who have oversight of subcontracted committees. So the US TAG, or Technical Advisory Group for Quality, is managed by the American Society for Quality. The American Committee, or TAG, for Health and Safety is managed by a Health and Safety Association. And what ANSI does is it has people who monitor the performance of the management of those committees to make sure that ballots, for example, are returned on time, that the work is progressing, that there's no conflicts of interest. But once they have subcontracted the committee, it's down to that committee management to choose the fees that it sets in order to participate, what they want to, and so some committees, for example, they like to have a big annual meeting. So they know they have to raise the fees for hiring the hall, for displays, for inviting speakers. So some committees are very expensive to participate on. Others, where it's a very narrow technical focus, the fees will be minimal. But that's their commercial model. It's not BSI's commercial model, it's not AFNOR's. So we all differ. I can remember one national standards body where the experts who came to ISO committees were government civil servants. And you're going, why are you here? You don't know what you're talking about. We have a policy. We only send civil servants to ISO work. Okay, that's not going to be particularly effective for you, but the national standards body is a government department, and the only people who work in it are civil servants. That was how they constructed it. In fact, I can actually answer the question why NIST is not the ISO member body. You said there was a legal reason.
Well, when I asked this, they told me that it was a legal reason.
Yes, do you know what the legal reason is? NIST is not allowed to pay fees to a foreign institution. So NIST, being a government department, is not allowed to pay the ISO membership fee, which is why it was devolved to ANSI. So there's lots of politics and lots of ways of working. ISO does not dictate this. It depends what your national standards body wants to achieve and how it wants to achieve it. Okay.
¿Hay alguna otra pregunta? ¿Comentario? No? Well, apparently there are no more comments or questions.
Okay, I had planned to finish this presentation this morning before the coffee break. it seems I have half an hour in which to deal with the directives. Okay, I will try and deal with them fast. So the directives, you can access them for free. They're on this hyperlink. Part 1 is the procedures for the technical work. Part 2 is how you should format and present standards in the text of standards. Both ISO and IEC have their own particular supplements to the procedural part because they actually work in slightly different ways procedurally. IEC is much more centralized in the way it works compared to ISO. Sadly, what it means is for two international standards bodies having a standard for common procedures, the supplements are bigger than the core directives. Makes it a bit strange. New additions of the directives, or more particularly the supplements, are produced on the 1st of May every year. So 1st of May every year, I go to that hyperlink and I download my new edition of the directives. What is useful is that on the hyperlink, the ISO Central Secretariat staff also provide a summary of the key changes in the directives each year. So there will be a PowerPoint presentation of the key changes, but there will also be a track changes version compared to the previous year's version of the directives. So for me, I have to read all the changes, identify what impacts me, write rude letters to ISO saying, why have you made this stupid change? Change it back, please. Things like that. But if you just Google or do an internet search on ISO directives, it will take you directly to this page. So don't worry about writing the hyperlink, just ISO directive. Okay. There's a lot of variation in the way that national standards bodies run their development procedures, just as we were discussing a moment ago. So there's very little adoption of the ISO directives part 1 in national processes. So when we looked at the stages of ISO development, we had new work item proposal, we had working draft, we had committee draft, we had draft international standard, we had final draft international standard, and published standard. In BSI, we have the proposal, and then we have a draft for public review, or draft for public comment, and then we have the text for publication. So we have a simpler process, so we don't follow the directives. However, the directives part 2 on the format and presentation of standards, nearly all international standards bodies and national standards bodies have adopted that. There's very little change. The main purpose of the directives is to describe who has to do something, what they have to do, and how they're going to do it. There are lots of grey areas in the ISO directives. By grey, I mean ambiguous. And that's actually both an advantage and a disadvantage. It allows sectors with very different cultures. You know, I think some of you are from biosciences. Is that, what did you say your national committee was? Okay. Okay, so biodiversity, you will have a very different sectoral culture from, for instance, the people dealing with nuclear physics. You know, very, very different culture, and that would be an international culture. It's not necessarily just national. And that is allowed to be reflected in the ways the committees operate and manage themselves. So that's helpful. But at other times, these ambiguous areas lead to possible conflict because someone says, why are we not operating like that committee over there? And you go, because we don't have to. It's not given in the directives. So there's also variation due to human issues. You know, the chairman of a committee is like a manager, and you know that with managers, they have different personalities, they like things doing in different ways, so they will direct the committee to operate in a different way. I, as a committee manager, I have a personal style for writing reports of meetings or for presenting resolutions, and that's very different from someone from a completely different culture. So if you think about China, China writes from right to left. When you see someone from China who's not written English much, the first time they write English, they will write one complete block of text. There will be no paragraphs. There will be few sentence breaks. There's no bullet points. It's a continuous piece of text. So you have to say to them, no, please, can you break this down so that we have one sentence addresses one issue? So I personally use a lot of bullet points and very simple statements because I know that for those who don't speak English as their first language, having things expressed in a simple way helps them to understand, helps them to make the decisions we have to arrive at. So there can be variation due to the way that the personalities who lead the work operate. And whilst ISO is trying to become more efficient, and we had that discussion about timelines, actually it's beginning to upset some of the experts. What is the value to you as an expert of attending an ISO meeting? Now, you probably are sponsored by an organization because of all the travel costs or participation costs, or your country is sponsoring you. And yes, your mission is to get your country or your sponsor's viewpoint heard and taken into account, or even to try and dominate the discussion. But also a key element of this is networking. You want to find out what's happening from around the world. And in the old days, when you had a big ISO committee meeting, you were with people for 1 week, usually. And you would socialize with them, you would go to dinner with them, you would have lunch breaks with them, whatever. It enhanced the ability of the experts to network. If we're moving into a completely virtual environment, that all goes. In fact, it makes it difficult because you know nothing about the person that you're seeing on the screen, other than they're representing a certain country and a certain viewpoint. So there are some issues there. Now, supporting the ISO directives part 1, because there's lots of procedural stuff. Okay, so on the same page that you find the directives, you can also find statements about ISO's policies. The ISO directives, when they say, you know, you must present a new work item proposal on a certain form, well, there's a link to where you can find all of these forms. We use an online document archive and distribution system, which is called ISO Documents. So again, another supporting database. I mentioned earlier the online project management system, which is a nightmare, and don't trust anything you read there because I always forget to update it. But ISO has introduced a project management system to try and keep track of everything. When ballots are conducted, there's an online balloting system, and also when the national standards bodies submit comments, the comments get collated automatically. Not always. not always. There is a template for submitting comments. Please do not change anything on that template. If you change anything, the automatic collation tool will not function. And it only takes one country out of maybe 30 or 40 submitting comments for the whole system to stop. It then means that I, as the committee manager, have to manually collate all of the results. And that wastes time. It's not a useful use of my time. It delays me giving the results to the committee members. So please, do not change the header, even the bit in the grayed out header on the commenting template. Don't change it. It will throw the system out. It's a little bit awkward for if you want to submit diagrams or drawings, because suddenly you've got a Word template, which is like columns, and you've designed a very nice A4 size picture, and suddenly you have to shrink it to an attached file within a Word template. If you are going to do that, my suggestion would be actually send a copy directly to the committee manager for that committee and say, please circulate this as well as the comments. Okay, so that's my personal plea on the balloting system. There's an online meeting management system. So ISO defines rules about how much advance notice we must give for meetings. For a physical meeting of a technical committee or a subcommittee, we have to give 16 weeks notice. For a physical meeting of a working group, we have to give 6 weeks notice. For a virtual meeting of a technical committee or subcommittee, we have to give 8 weeks notice. For a virtual meeting of a working group, we have to give 4 weeks notice. This is historic, again, because when we worked only in the physical environment, people had to book flights, they had to book hotels, they had to get permission from their sponsor, or they had to get sponsorship from their sponsor in order to be able to attend. Also, the host needed time to prepare a venue, social functions, sponsorship for their own hosting of the meeting. So you can understand why in the old days, it was 4 months notice effectively for a meeting. These days, 8 weeks for a virtual meeting, okay, perhaps countries have problems finding experts, they need to spend a bit of time with their national process to get them ready. Working groups don't abide by the 4-week rule very well. When you're under time pressure, you've just got the results of a ballot and you've got 350 comments to process, you've got 50 pages of processing to do, and yet you've only got 4 months in which to get to the next stage, development stage. You're going to want to call meetings every 2 weeks. So committees tend to be a little bit flexible about the 4-week rule for virtual working group meetings. ISO hasn't clamped down on us yet about that. We're waiting to see how that progresses, but at the moment it seems to be generally tolerated. Sometimes I've had complaints from national standard bodies saying this particular working group is calling meetings at 2 days' notice. Our experts have to book time away from work to participate. That's not acceptable. In which case we have a conversation with the convener and say, no, come on, 2 days is really pushing the 4-week limit. 3 weeks, maybe 2 weeks, yeah. So we have an ISO meeting system. We then have a database of people and their access authorities, and that's controlled by the national standard bodies. So in the past, the committee secretary could register people as members of the committee, but that doesn't happen anymore. ISO is very strict. Only the national standards body can register experts to participate on committees and on working groups. So if you want to participate, please talk to DGN. A number of committees have been allowed to prepare their own websites. Now, on the ISO online system, there are pages for every single committee that ISO has established, but they tend to be slightly bureaucratic standards language pages. A number of committees like this one, which is the Committee for ISO 9001 or the Committee for ISO 14001, you know, they want to market what they're doing, they want to involve people more widely, so they have their own web pages. Obviously, if we're moving to conducting meetings by webinar, ISO also has a Zoom account, and it provides committee chairs, committee managers, working group conveners with an ISO Zoom account. So you don't have to use your own. One thing you would warn, if you are already using Zoom and you become an ISO convener and want an ISO account, you have to remove your current personal Zoom account. They can't have the conflict of the same email address being used for two different Zoom accounts. Okay. The ISO online browsing platform, that's a wonderful tool. I highly recommend it to you. You may not know this, but in a standard, you have different sections. You have a forward, you have an introduction, you have the clause 1, which defines the scope of the standard. You have clause 2 that defines any normative references, and you have clause 3 that defines any terms and definitions. Now, while the whole text of the standard is copyrighted to ISO, the online browsing platform gives you the forward introduction and down to clause 3 terms and definitions available for free to look at. In terms of standards development activity, if you're trying to define a term, it's much easier to use an existing term from another standard than have to think up a new definition yourself. So this tool allows you to go and look to see what other definitions exist in other standards. It also allows you access to quite a lot of information about those other standards. So please do have a look at the online browsing platform. It's very helpful. I mentioned earlier a bit about online authoring, where, like in Google Docs, the text is there and you can write your comments against it. That's still in the pilot stage. ISO about 2 years ago established a YouTube training site. There are a lot of very helpful videos there, which will probably correct everything I've been telling you. So please go and take a look at this website. Okay. That's really the part 1 and what's available to support part 1. Part 2, obviously it describes the different parts of a standard. It describes what parts are mandatory and which are optional. It gives any mandatory text that you have to use in a standard, and it gives the presentation rules. When I said that most national standards bodies have adopted the part 2, there are 2 issues that come up that cause variation. In Mexico, do you use the decimal point or the decimal comma? You use the point. Okay, well, that's probably the American influence on you. The French hate the decimal point. They want the decimal comma to win. So when you see the directives, they're actually written with the decimal comma, but you just need to be mindful. Also, certain words such as sulfur are spelt in different ways. So we adopt the English spelling, the Americans prefer the American spelling. I talked jokingly about the differences in Spanish. Well, the differences in English are quite interesting as well. As formal reference texts, the ISO directives part 2 only used to reference English dictionaries, English dictionaries. And it was a huge concession to the Americans 10 years ago when we allowed the American dictionaries to be referenced. But we haven't lost the battle. Most of the editors in ISO are British, and they are not accepting American spellings. Okay, well, I'm joking again. But for instance, when you have an IEEE standard being adopted by IEC, it will maintain the American spelling. So there are some slight variations, okay? Now, to support the part 2 of the directives, there is a lot of helpful information, okay? I can't read this on my screen, excuse me. The first item on the left is what's called the ISO template. This is an electronic file that you can adopt that becomes a Word template, and it gives you the main structure of the standard and the main clauses and the mandatory text, and you can just input it. In BSI, we had quite a lot of problems with the template because there was some conflict between what ISO was producing and how our laptops have been set up. So it may or may not be helpful to you, but there is an electronic document template. The next document is requirements and guidelines for the submissions of drafts to ISO Central Secretariat. This is when you as a committee secretary have to prepare a DIS document or an FDIS document and to send it to ISO for them to start balloting it amongst all the ISO national standards bodies. For example, if a standard includes a diagram or a drawing, a formal technical drawing, then there are certain formats that the drawing has to be created in, such as TIF files. And there's a checklist on that document of, have you provided the main text? Have you provided a PDF version of that text so that there's a reference copy? Have you provided the drawing file? Have you provided a PDF of it? So it's a helpful checklist, but that's useful later on in the development process. The next document, the ISO House Style, it's an online document. It's a recent creation and is very, very helpful. If you are writing standards, please take a look at that document. The part 2 of the directives is very prescriptive because it has to be, but there's lots of bits missing. So if I was to say to you, how many lists of bullet points can you have in a clause in an ISO standard? Can you give me an answer? Would you care to guess? 10 lists? Okay. The answer currently is the preferred number is 2. You have to think about a legal contract. If you were presented with a legal contract, every sentence or paragraph would have a number against it, usually. This is so that you can instantly reference the requirement you're talking about. And actually, ISO would like standards to be prepared that way. So you have clause 3, 3.1, 3.1.1.1, 3.1.1.1.1, etc. But it doesn't suit readability too easily, or some people complain. So we have different levels of bullets. So you can have actually the primary level of a bullet is an ABC list. And then the secondary level is 1, 2, 3. And then the tertiary level is I1, I2, I3. That's within a single set of bullet lists. But actually, what they allow is an ABC list and then what is called a dashed bullet list. And those are the two sets of bullets you are generally allowed within a single clause. But it depends on the editor you're dealing with and whether you're very nice, and if you send them Christmas cards, and if you say, please, I want 3 lists in this clause. But, okay, so the house style tells you these sorts of things. The house style tells you punctuation. For example, when you write a sentence and you go, you know, like in movies, ... something's coming. How many dots are you allowed? 3. Yes, 3 is right. Do you know what the dots are called? The official name for the dots is ellipses. Okay, but they're standardized. You have 3 dots. The square root sign has a special name. These are all the sorts of things defined in the Part 2 directives, but the house style explains a bit about why. So I very strongly recommend you look at the house style. There is a guidance document on drafting made efficient. Okay, it's helpful guidance. There is best practices for vocabularies and terminologies. People get very stuck on developing terms and definitions. I have a personal belief that for management system standards, unlike most technical standards, you expect a technical expert to read the standard. And therefore, having a defined technical term is sometimes useful because you're strictly clarifying between 2 different concepts, which in that field might be helpful. But when you have a management system standard, anyone can become a manager. Anyone. And they're going to read the standard and they read the word risk and they go, yeah, I know, risk, that's something bad. But actually we have a huge argument with the Committee for Risk because they're saying risk can be positive and helpful. No. I'm sorry. My committee has huge problems. There's a big war going on the definition of risk right now. So for me, what the management standards have is, although there are about 20 defined terms, most people reading them would go, well, I know what risk is, I know what opportunity is, I know what an organization is. Why do I need definitions? Well, I also remember when I start standards projects, I say to people, please try not to spend too much time on terms and definitions. And what happens? By the end of the time when the standard is published, about 60 to 70% of the time would have been spent on terms and definitions. You wonder why they're so badly written? And not only do they spend that time developing terms and definitions, they then don't apply them consistently in the text. So why did you waste all that time? But some standards drafters get very stuck with terms and definitions. So this is a useful practice approach for vocabularies and terminologies. ISO has a number of reference standards giving guidance on how you should define your concepts before you start trying to narrow down to the term and then the definition. So that's helpful. The next one is guidance on legal statements in ISO standards. That's a new document. ISO originally has a policy that ISO standards may not demand compliance with laws and regulations. And some people find that very strange. When the Committee for Environmental Protection, ISO 14001, was writing the standard, or the Committee for Health and Safety, they were saying no one should be allowed to get certified unless they can prove they are legally compliant to begin with. But ISO's policy is based on the fact that, well, if you are already required to do something by law, why should we be enforcing what you're already required to do? We're just reinforcing something you already have to do. Therefore, there is no point in ISO standards demanding compliance, because you are already, either as an organization or as an individual, required to be compliant. And it's not our problem if you're not. It's the regulatory authority or the legal authority's problem. But there's been a big argument because some of the regulatory fines now, if a big health and safety problem occurs, can be very expensive. An organization can be charged in some cases up to 10% of its global revenues for a major health and safety breach. So within the management system standards, we have argued that managing compliance should be permitted. We should say the organization should manage its compliance. We are not saying the organization shall be compliant. So that's the basis of this guidance. It was written to clarify that difference between saying you should have a process for managing your compliance rather than demanding compliance. The next document is the drawing directives. As I mentioned, there are certain formats that have to be presented for drawings, and this tells you about that. And the last one is guidance for coding XML text. One issue with XML text that some of you may have noticed, in the old days, if you had a table that went beyond the page, you used to repeat the heading of the table for each new page. That doesn't happen anymore. The reason being that with XML, they're expecting the text to be read online, so you can't keep repeating the heading for that process. Why they can't have a system that extracts the intermediate headings for XML, I don't know, but you will see that now when you've got long tables in standards, you no longer have the headings repeated. For those who are very new to standards and want a lot of guidance, there are two documents called the RICE model, and they're like a demonstration of how you should lay out a standard. And they're very helpful. So again, if you want some advice on how to set up a standard, the sorts of words you might use in the scope statement, the sorts of words you might use in some of your key requirements, please take a look at these two documents. One is for creating a standard, the other is for creating an amendment. Okay? And that's about it for part 2 of the directives. So my question to you, how many clauses can a standard have? Can someone tell me? Any? Yes. And what do the titles of those clauses have to be?
The title.
Yeah.
Well.
Thank you. So please, when you go to a standards committee, don't ask the committee manager, what clauses must I write in my standard? It's up to you. Beyond clauses 1, 2, and 3, everything else is open game. It depends how many you want. There is a restriction on the number of sub-clauses. We are allowed 5 levels of sub-clauses. And some people just go, 5? No, you can't have more than 1 or 2. No, we're allowed 5 levels of sub-clauses. So please think about that. In terms of titles, the titles cannot be written as questions. That is a drafting issue that a lot of people have problems with. You know, they say, would like to introduce questions. You have to be more statement oriented. Okay. Monica, I don't think I've got time to actually open the directives and go through them, but I will do if you're enthusiastic to stay on and go through that.
I think that we will definitely need to invite you again, Charles. to
Okay.
Probably continue with this topic. Unfortunately, we cannot continue anymore because the room is going to be occupied.
Oh, okay. I'm sorry.
Very much for your very interesting presentation, and I think that everybody agrees that it was very useful. And now I am certain that our experts in our Mtro committees and our international experts will have more background around this particular issue. Thank you very much. There are a lot of congratulations in YouTube as well for you. Thank you for the presentation. And it is always a pleasure to have you. Also, thank you for agreeing coming to the university and give us or teach us about this topic, where you are a real expert.
Okay.
Thank you everybody for. I am going to switch to Spanish now. Muchas gracias a todos ustedes por el favor de su presencia. Espero que haya sido un curso interesante para ustedes. Vamos a invitar obviamente a Charles en otra oportunidad para que nos hable con más profundidad de estos temas, pero ahorita para nuestros expertos de los comités de espejo era muy importante tener este curso, esta aproximación, sobre todo porque ya hay algunos de ustedes que están trabajando a nivel internacional representando a DGN y al país en estos comités internacionales, y es muy importante este background para precisamente profundizar en las directivas que, bueno, ya ustedes conocen, y recordarles nuevamente lo que decía Charles. Hay una sección de entrenamiento de ISO en YouTube que les hemos compartido anteriormente, donde pueden ustedes ver temas muy específicos de cómo se desarrollan las normas que tiene la ISO, y que además son cursos muy accesibles y muy entendibles, ¿no? Entonces, pues muchísimas gracias a todos. Otra vez bienvenidos todos nuestros colegas de la DGN, un gusto tenerlos siempre con nosotros. Esta es su universidad. Y bueno, pues si me lo permiten, ya nada más les quiero hacer un breve comentario muy rápidamente, y es sobre la maestría en sistemas de gestión de calidad. Acabamos de lograr la aprobación para que puedan ingresar por medio de un diplomado. Ya tengo, me acaban de mandar ahorita, está el doctor Barragán con nosotros, que es uno de los responsables de esta actividad en la Facultad de Química. Me acaba de mandar ya el cartel del diplomado. Se los vamos a estar enviando. Sé que muchos de ustedes están interesados. Este diplomado vamos a tener excelentes expertos como Charles y otros que ya conocen, como la doctora Mercedes Silvestre, impartiéndolo, y invitados también especiales. Entonces, les haremos llegar la información para que nos ayuden también a promoverlo con aquellos colegas que sabemos que necesitan aprender de esto porque están relacionados con el medio. Entonces, pues muchísimas gracias a todos, que pasen una muy bonita tarde, y a los que ya no nos dé oportunidad de verlos porque la universidad sale de vacaciones pronto, desearles una muy feliz Navidad, un 2023 lleno de mucho éxito, y esperamos verlos muy pronto el siguiente año. Gracias a todos.
If you forgive me, there is one thing I need to show you extra. So, earlier I was saying, what is a standard? And I was talking about it could be any type of document or even a physical object. So you need to know this. That is an official ISO standard, how to make a cup of tea. Yes? You know the Ig Nobel prizes? So, oh, sorry, I have to go one more. Yes. Okay, and if you don't like tea, the Irish National Standards Body has a standard for making a cup of coffee. And don't forget the Russians have Russian standard vodka. So really, we can standardize anything. The question is, what is the need for it? Yes. Okay, thank you very much. No, you need a national standard for tequila. Okay. Ah, then please send me a copy. Yes. Yes.